What would you do if you discovered a piece of your family's history that changed everything? For Richard, a simple visit to his late father's old cafe turned into a journey of rediscovery and transformation. A former city dweller with a bustling corporate job, Richard never thought he'd return to the small town of his childhood. Yet here he was, standing in the quiet cafe his father had left behind, debating whether to sell or keep it. As he wandered through the familiar yet distant space, something on the kitchen counter caught his eye, a battered old coffee machine. Its worn exterior spoke of countless mornings and memories. But what truly stopped Richard in his tracks was a small engraving on the side: "The first coffee machine I ever bought. May it bring me luck." It was his father's handwriting. Suddenly, Richard was no longer standing in a cafe. He was back in his childhood, watching his father transform his grandfather's old repair shop into this cozy little cafe, named in his grandfather's honor. The machine before him wasn't just a relic, it was a symbol of his family's dreams, resilience, and history. Overwhelmed by emotion, Richard made a life-changing decision. He wouldn't sell the cafe. Instead, he would honor his father's legacy and try to build something of his own in this quiet, sleepy town. Richard had a hard time finding a place to live in the small town. Almost every house was designed for families, and there weren't many small apartments available. Eventually, he came across a single-story cabin a little outside town. It was the kind of place people rented for short stays, travelers passing through or those on vacation. The price was perfect for Richard, and since it was a short-term rental, it came fully furnished. The cabin was well-kept, clean, and cozy. The owner, who had known Richard since he was a kid and had been a close friend of his dad's, was thrilled to rent it to him. Sure, it was a bit of a drive, about 15 or 20 minutes to town, but Richard didn't mind. Back in the city, he was used to commuting for hours, often taking multiple forms of transportation just to get from one place to another. This short drive felt like a luxury in comparison. Weeks passed, and Richard started to settle into his new life. The transition wasn't easy, but he was managing. The only thing bothering him was the creeping sense of loneliness. At 35, he had never really thought about marriage or settling down. Most of the women he had dated in the city were just like him, living fast-paced lives, focused on their careers and looking for something casual. Relationships were fun, but they were fleeting, and nothing had ever turned serious. Life moved so fast in the city that there was never time to stop and think about what was missing. But here, in the quiet of this small town, Richard couldn't help but think about it. How was it possible for time to move so much slower here? How did people live such calm, steady lives? Was it better this way? Or was the city's hustle and bustle, where life seemed to pass you by in a blur, actually easier to handle? These questions swirled around in his head constantly, and he didn't have the answers. Whenever the thoughts became too overwhelming, he would throw himself into work at the cafe. The cafe was doing well, though. The locals appreciated the changes Richard had made, and the two employees he worked with got along well with him. Even though Richard kept a certain distance from both his staff and the townsfolk, it wasn't because he didn't like them. It was because he couldn't shake the thought that he might go back to the city someday. Knowing that he could always return to his old life kept him from forming deep connections here. Still, the cafe brought in enough money to cover his expenses and more. Life in the small town was far more affordable than in the city, and he knew he could live comfortably here if he wanted to. But the adjustment was still hard. The slow pace of this life, while peaceful, felt unfamiliar and heavy to him. Maybe this is the kind of place to live when I'm older, he thought to himself one evening. For now, though, he was just trying to figure it all out. One evening, after sending his employees home, Richard decided to make himself a coffee for the road. Snow had started falling, and the peaceful scene outside the cafe windows felt like it deserved to be celebrated with a warm cup in hand. As he prepared his coffee in the kitchen, a sudden noise startled him, a sharp thud against the cafe's front window. If you've made it this far and are enjoying the story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Your support helps us bring more heartfelt stories to life. Heart pounding, Richard rushed outside to investigate. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. A frail old man, dressed in thin pajamas and barefoot, was sitting alone in the snow just outside the cafe. The man held his head in his hands, rocking back and forth. Richard approached him cautiously, trying to offer comfort, but the man flinched, clearly startled. Richard asked him questions. "Are you okay? What happened? Can you hear me?" But the man only mumbled incoherent words. His tone swung between angry outbursts and tearful despair, repeating, "What happened?" Without hesitation, Richard took off his coat and wrapped it around the man. He guided him gently into his car, turned on the heat, and drove through the snowy streets. The town was quiet, the roads deserted, but eventually Richard found the hospital. The medical team sprang into action, wrapping the man in warm blankets and examining him quickly. Richard, still shaken, told them he didn't know the man and had found him outside his cafe. The doctor on duty, a calm and composed woman about Richard's age, reassured him. "Don't worry, we know who he is. That's Albert," she said gently. "He has early-stage Alzheimer's. Sometimes patients in this condition get confused, forget who they are or where they're supposed to be, and wander off. It's disorienting and terrifying for them." Her soothing tone began to calm Richard's nerves. He nodded silently as the doctor continued, "Don't worry, we'll contact his family. This is a small town, everyone knows each other to some extent. You did the right thing bringing him here." Richard exhaled deeply, the adrenaline in his system starting to fade. As he stood there, still processing the evening's events, the doctor turned to leave. Then, as if struck by curiosity, she paused and turned back. "Sorry to ask," she began hesitantly, "but are you here on vacation? I haven't seen you before. Where did you find Albert?" Richard quickly explained that he wasn't just passing through. He shared how the cafe had belonged to his father and how he'd recently taken over the business. The doctor's expression softened, and she extended a hand. "I'm Alice," she said with a warm smile. "I've been here for about 2 years." Richard shook her hand, his own smile appearing almost involuntarily. "I'm Richard," he replied. "I've been here about a month." Alice seemed kind and approachable, her demeanor both professional and inviting. Richard hadn't felt drawn to anyone in a long time, but something about Alice sparked his interest. For a brief moment, he considered asking if she'd like to grab a coffee sometime. But he hesitated. Would that seem too forward? Too soon? Instead, he thanked her quietly and made his way back to his cabin, the snowy night stretching ahead of him. As he drove home, the image of Alice's warm smile lingered in his mind. The next morning, Richard woke up to a calm and snowy day. As he sat up in bed, the thought of the approaching new year crossed his mind. "Dad never cared much for holiday decorations, but I love them," he thought, then paused for a moment. Just a month ago, Richard's mornings were completely different. His day would start with waiting in line at some chain coffee shop for what felt like forever. Then he'd squeeze onto 2 crowded buses just to barely make it to work on time. Hours of dealing with endless tasks and people followed. Lunchtime? Rushed, unhealthy fast food. After work, it was back to the buses, maybe meeting some friends at a bar to watch a random game, then straight to bed. Days blurred into weeks and weeks into months. Back then, he only knew it was the holiday season because of the flashy decorations in malls or the tiny year-end bonus his job would hand out. Now, looking out of the window at the blanket of snow, Richard stopped and thought, what a miserable way to live. Today he woke up to the perfect winter scene. He wasn't rushing anywhere. He had time to plan how he'd add a little holiday cheer to his cafe for his customers. There was no commute stress, no pressure to meet deadlines, and for the first time, a single day actually felt like 24 hours. Excited to get on the road, Richard headed out. This wasn't the kind of journey filled with honking horns or impatient crowds. No, this was a ride through serene, snow-covered streets. Still, as wonderful as this new life felt, one thought lingered in his mind: will I always live this life alone? When Richard arrived at the cafe, his staff had already taken care of the morning prep. After a quick chat with them, he headed to the kitchen to make himself the perfect cup of coffee and ensure everything was ready for service. As he emerged from the kitchen, coffee in hand, he noticed a woman sitting by the window. Her back was to the counter, her face turned toward the snowy view outside. Her thick, golden hair fell gracefully over her shoulders, catching the light as if it were glowing. She wore a red scarf, her posture poised yet relaxed, as if she belonged in the serene picture of the winter morning. One of the staff approached Richard and said, "She asked for you. We told her to wait, hope that's okay." Richard felt his heart skip a beat, curiosity and excitement swelling inside him. He quickly grabbed another mug, poured a fresh cup of coffee and walked toward her. "Hello," he greeted her nervously. When the woman turned to face him, Richard froze in surprise. It was Alice, the doctor from the hospital. "Hello, Richard," she said warmly. Richard quickly handed her the coffee, suddenly at a loss for words. His nerves had tied his tongue in knots. Alice accepted the mug with a smile. "Thank you," she said, taking a sip before adding, "Today's my day off. I wanted to stop by and see the cafe. I haven't been here in ages." "Welcome," Richard finally managed, his voice steadying. "I'm glad you did." What started as simple pleasantries soon turned into a deeper conversation. Richard learned that Alice had been assigned to the town as a doctor 2 years ago. Like him, she had previously worked in a big city. The similarity of their stories intrigued him. As Alice shared her experiences, Richard felt an unexpected sense of relief. Talking to someone who had gone through the same struggles as he was facing now felt comforting. Alice admitted that the adjustment had been challenging at first, but she had slowly built a life for herself here, one that she had grown to love. Her openness and positivity left a lasting impression on Richard. Her story wasn't just relatable, it was inspiring. For the first time, Richard wondered if this small-town life could be more than just a temporary chapter in his story. Perhaps like Alice, he too could find a way to make this place feel like home. In the following weeks, Alice and Richard began seeing more of each other. At first, their interactions were brief. Alice would stop by the cafe during her breaks, and Richard would occasionally ask her how Albert was doing. But their conversations grew longer, more personal, and filled with a quiet comfort neither of them had expected. One snowy afternoon, Alice stopped by the cafe again, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Richard, who was busy behind the counter, couldn't help but notice how her laughter seemed to fill the room as she greeted the staff. When Alice reached the counter, she gave Richard a warm smile. "I think I've officially become a regular," she joked. "Well, it's always nice to have good company," Richard replied, pouring her favorite coffee. Alice sat down by the window as usual, and after a moment of hesitation, Richard decided to take a break and join her. Richard found himself opening up in ways he hadn't in years. "I never thought I'd be running my dad's cafe," he admitted, staring into his cup, "but somehow, this place feels like the one thing I've done right." Alice reached out, her fingers brushing his hand briefly. "Sometimes the things we least expect end up being exactly what we need," she said softly. As Christmas approached, Richard decided to decorate the cafe with festive lights and ornaments. When Alice stopped by one evening and saw the decorations, her face lit up. "It looks magical," she said, her eyes sparkling. "I can't take all the credit," Richard replied. "The staff helped, but I did insist on the mistletoe." He gestured to the tiny green plant hanging near the counter and they both laughed. Encouraged by her reaction, Richard asked, "Would you like to help me pick out a tree for the cafe? I could use some advice." Alice's smile widened. "I'd love to." The next day they drove to a nearby tree farm, bundled in warm coats and scarves. As they wandered through rows of evergreens, Alice teased Richard for being too picky. "It's a Christmas tree, not a piece of fine art," she laughed. When they finally agreed on a tree, they carried it back to the cafe together. As they set it up, their hands brushed several times, and Richard couldn't ignore the warmth that spread through him every time their eyes met. One evening, after the cafe had closed, Alice stayed to help Richard with some paperwork. When they finished, Richard walked her to her car. Snow was falling gently, blanketing the street in white. They stood there for a moment, neither wanting to say goodbye just yet. "It's nights like these that make this place special," Alice said, looking up at the snow. Richard nodded, his breath visible in the cold air. "You're right. It's peaceful. And I'm glad you're here." Alice turned to face him, her smile fading slightly as her expression softened. "Me too," she said quietly. Before he could overthink it, Richard leaned in and kissed her. It was gentle, hesitant at first, but as Alice kissed him back, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Alice brought warmth and light into Richard's world, and in turn, Richard reminded Alice of the beauty and simplicity and the joy of having someone to share it with. The cafe, once a place filled with memories of Richard's past, now became a symbol of new beginnings. And as the snow continued to fall that winter, Richard realized he wasn't alone anymore. He had found someone who understood him, someone who made him believe that starting over wasn't just possible, it was worth it. Together, Richard and Alice began building a story that was uniquely theirs, filled with love, laughter, and the kind of moments that make life extraordinary. Thank you for watching this story of love, rediscovery, and new beginnings. If you enjoyed it, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear how this story made you feel. Until next time, stay safe and stay inspired.